a contract to govern and conduct business ethically and morally. It is essential, as these are the very fabric, the very glue on which society is based. Given the past 10 years, no one can be criticized for not holding out at this stage much hope that politicians and many obstinately uncooperative businessmen will reform and act ethically. Despite this, hope we do and hope we must. We all look very forward to your address, Professor Rossouw. Thank you.
Thank you, Dale, and thank you for that introduction. Good to be reminded how far this whole tradition of ethics goes back. It is simply a part of human behavior ever since humans started interacting with one another. Mike, also thank you to you. And just before I start, can I just check quickly with you, Mike? You can hear, see me well, and also see my slides on the screen.
Absolutely. Both the sound and the visuals are coming through particularly clearly this morning, and I think that augurs well for a great session. If I may, just before you start, Prof, just alert everyone they can start formulating their questions now if they so choose, and then send it through on the chat facility, and I will certainly recognize them during the Q&A session. So back to you, Prof.
Okay, thanks, Mike. So the focus of this presentation this morning is to look at what's the state of ethics in both the public and the private sectors here in South Africa. And if I can just also add to what Mike has said, please feel free to ask your questions. And Mike, you are welcome to interrupt me at any point if there are interesting questions coming through on the Q&A. Okay, so let's start with the Edelman Trust Barometer. It's a study that is released every year at the World Economic Forum in Davos. And I want to start with some findings of the 2021 Edelman Trust Barometer. And both Canada and South Africa is included in the 28 countries who participate in this survey. So let's start with trust in business. And I just compared South Africa and Canada over the last 5 years. And you can see that in both countries, there's an increase in trust in business. And the levels of trust are quite comparable, a bit higher in South Africa than in Canada at the moment. But when we look at trust in government, or in government rather, it's an altogether different picture that emerges. Because if we look at trust in government and once again compare South Africa and Canada over the last 5 years, we can see that levels of trust in Canada are fairly high at almost 60% of people who say that they trust their government. But compare that with South Africa and also compare that with trust in business, we can see quite a dismal picture emerging. Although there is some improvement, it's nevertheless extremely high at, in the last survey, 27% of South Africans trusting their government. And as you can see, it is less than half of the trust that people have in business. But let me also start at the beginning. Dale, thank you for your dictionary definitions of ethics. I always define ethics around the concepts of the self, the good, and the other, implying that one is ethical when you don't only consider what is good for yourself, but when you balance that with what is good for others. So ethics always has to do with how I treat other people in a manner that's not only good for me, but also good for those who are affected by what I do or what I say. And there's some notion of this that we get universally right around the world. It's called golden rule. And the golden rule simply states, always do good as you expect others to do good unto yourself. But obviously this morning we are interested not in ethics in general, but more specifically in ethics in organizations. And taking my guide from the Fourth King report on corporate governance here in South Africa, normally referring to as King 4, it says that in the context of organizations, ethics refers to ethical values applied to decision-making, conduct, and the relationship between the organization, its stakeholders, and the broader society. I hope you can see our triangle of the self, the good, and the other making an appearance here again. Because when it says, it talks about the ethical values, it's our understanding of what we consider to be good, right, just, acceptable. And it's that standard of what is right and acceptable, what is good, that the organization, the collective self now, the we, not the I, that they apply when they make decisions, conduct themselves, and in their relationships with their stakeholders, both internal and external stakeholders, but also the broader society. And that, of course, is once again the other. So when we talk about ethics, I want us to understand that it is about a set of standards that we have adopted in our organizations or in our personal capacity, and that we apply when we interact with other people through what we do or through what we say. Okay, now let's talk about the governance of ethics in organizations. And here I want to draw your attention to the second principle of the Fourth King report that says the governing body should govern the ethics of the organization in a way that supports the establishment of an ethical culture. In other words, it puts an obligation on the governing bodies, the boards of companies in the private sector, but also organizations in the public sector, to ensure that ethics is managed in a way in the organization that the outcome of that is an ethical culture. Now, you most probably will ask me, so how do you do it? How do you ensure that you govern ethics in a manner that leads to the outcome of an ethical culture? In other words, an outcome where doing the right thing has become normal, has become a habit, and people do the right thing even when nobody is watching. That is what it means to create an ethical culture in an organization. I would like to introduce you just very briefly to the approach that we take at the Ethics Institute, where I'm the CEO of the organization. And we say, culture is an outcome. Where does it start? It always starts with leadership. Unless you have committed leaders at the top of your organization, you almost can practically forget about ever having an ethical culture. A very close link between leadership commitment and culture. But then you also need your governance structures. In other words, your board of directors or whatever other governance structure you have to exercise oversight of ethics to ensure that the organization is on its path to cultivating such an ethical culture. But then ethics, like anything else in organizations, can't manage itself. It's like finance or sales. These things simply can't manage themselves. You need someone to take responsibility for managing ethics in the organization. And that is what we normally would call the ethics manager or the ethics officer of an organization. And in our larger companies here in South Africa, we have a team of people that we call the ethics office, who is responsible for managing ethics in the organization. And they typically would do 5 things. They would first of all conduct the ethics risk assessment to determine what is going right and what is going wrong as far as ethics is concerned in the organization. Based on that, they can then start developing an ethics strategy. What do we want to change? What do we want to focus on over the next year or 2 or 3 years? And that ethics strategy is then translated into an ethics management plan that needs to be executed. The third responsibility is to ensure that there's clarity about your ethical standards. And that would normally come in the form of a code of ethics or of ethics-related policies like gift policies, conflict of interest policies. And then comes the hard work of institutionalizing ethics. In other words, making ethics a part of how we do our business. And it is here where things like communication becomes important. Very important that leaders talk on a regular basis about ethics in the organization. But also that ordinary employees start having ethical conversations, ethics talk in the organization. It's also about training and making sure that people are familiar with your ethical standards, and also about motivating people to indeed abide by your ethical standards. And then finally, the people responsible for managing ethics in organizations should monitor what is going on. Are we moving in the right or wrong direction? Are we receiving reports about wrongdoing, and what type of wrongdoing is it? And a whole lot of things that can be monitored to give you indication of how well are we doing with our ethics management. And of course, they should also monitor the implementation of your ethics management plan. And this ultimately put your people responsible for ethics management in a position to report back to your governance structures, like a board committee responsible for ethics. The final element of our approach to governing and managing organizational ethics is to say that from time to time, there should be an independent assessment of how well we are doing. And this is typically where internal audit function would step in and assess the adequacy and the effectiveness of your ethics management program. And that would typically be reported also then back to your board or whatever other governance structure you have. And they would then also, in their external annual reporting, also report on the ethics of the organization. So this, in short, is the model that we use when we work with organizations in both the public sector, but also the private sector in South Africa. And it is also the model that, to a large extent, has now been accepted also in the King Report on corporate governance for South Africa. Okay, so let's start with the public sector and look at what is the state of affairs in our public sector in South Africa when it comes to ethics specifically. And there are a number of things in place. In other words, there are ethical standards. In our constitution already, there are the constitutional values and principles that has a strong ethical character, and that provides the basis for everything that we do in the public service. There's also the Batupele principles that also spells out the ethical values that should inform public servants, and there's the code of conduct for public servants as we find it in the public service regulations. In terms of ethics infrastructure, management infrastructure, the 2016 public service regulations make it mandatory for all departments on national and provincial levels to have an ethics committee that oversees the ethics of the department, and it also makes it compulsory to have dedicated ethics officers who are responsible for managing ethics in the organization. Then, in addition to that, also the Public Administration Management Act made provision for a new unit in the Department of Public Service Administration with the very short name of the Public Administration Ethics, Integrity and Disciplinary Technical Assistance Unit. Okay, they don't come much longer than that. As far as training on ethics in the public sector is concerned, as the Ethics Institute, we present a number of programs. Our flagship program is the Ethics Officer Certification Program, and we have dedicated programs for both the public sector and the private sector, and we also offer training on how to run an ethics committee. The National School of Government also has programs, ethics as part of the induction process of public servants. There's programs on ethics management and also a compulsory online ethics program since 2016. As far as professionalization is concerned, there are entry requirements for appointment onto the level of senior management and also competency assessments that needs to be done. Then there's a very strong focus on avoiding conflicts of interest and to manage conflicts of interest. And we find that in the financial disclosure framework. We also find it in a e-platform for disclosures of conflicts of interest. And there's a clear guidance that and a clear directive that public servants may not conduct business with any organ of state, not only your own department, but any other organ of state. And on top of that, there's also a mechanism for whistleblowing, for protected disclosures. There's the National Anti-Corruption Hotline, there are departmental hotlines, and all of this then, or in addition to all of this, there's also the Public Disclosures Act. In other words, the Whistleblowing Act that was amended again in 2017, and there are also specific guidance made available to the public service as far as these disclosures are concerned. Okay, let me take you now to some of the findings. This is the Public Sector Ethics Survey that is conducted by the Ethics Institute in close collaboration with the Department of Public Service and Administration, the Department of Cooperative Governance, and also the South African Local Government Association. And we do this on a regular basis. The last survey that we've done is in 2018. As we speak, we are busy with the 2021 version, so this will be the first update. And you can see that we conducted that in both the local government, national and provincial government, and we had a sample of over 8,700, almost 8,750 participants. And this is what we found the most pressing problems were, and probably still are, in the public sector. The first one there is inconsistency in the application of rules and disciplines, and the discipline that follows with that. In other words, also the inconsistent application of discipline when things go wrong. So, in other words, the problem is not the rules or the regulations, but with the application and with the consequences that should follow if there is not adherence to those rules. The second category is abuse of time. In other words, late coming, absenteeism, or what is also called in number 5, presenteeism, people being at work but not working, and also the abuse of resources for personal matters. So you can see a lot of the ethical issues relate specifically to abuse of position or abuse of resources and not doing your best. And if we tie that in with the 7th one on that list, is that there are no consequences for unethical behavior. And these are public servants who identified this. And they said, well, if we look at these things together, of course, it is problematic. The third biggest problem that was found is victimization of employees who differ with their managers. In other words, when people would raise certain concerns and specifically then also ethical concerns. In other words, when they report unethical behavior to managers, instead of being listened to, there was an experience amongst public servants that they get intimidated, they get victimized for speaking up on ethical issues. The fourth one, and you can see it also relate to number 8 and 9, is the whole issue of incompetence or unqualified people being appointed. And you can see it relates directly also to the 8th reason or manifestation of unethical behavior, which is abuse of cadre deployment. In other words, inappropriate political interference in appointment, and also nepotism, where jobs is being given to family members and friends. And of course, all of this translates into the fact that we don't appoint the most competent people in jobs. And the final one there then is political interference. Now, there's interference in the work of departments by politicians. So those are the big issues, the most prominent forms of unethical behavior that we found in the public sector. And I will not be surprised if we see the same in the survey that we are conducting in November this year. However, I think there's also something on the brighter side that is emerging, and that has to do with awareness of ethics initiatives. And you can see in just about all those factors, there was an increase from the previous surveys that we conducted. As far as awareness of the code of conduct, 90% of people said they are aware. They know the policy on gift, 83% concurred with that, 82% that they know the policy on private work. Almost half, 48, received training, and it's considerably up from the previous survey. Awareness of the hotline for reporting went down somewhat, and then there was quite an increase in the awareness of the position of the ethics officer. But you would appreciate that ethics officers only became a requirement through the public service regulations of 2016. Okay. So just by way of concluding on what is happening in the public sector, we work very closely also with the Public Service Commission, and these are the things that we identified that we really need in order to have an effective public sector, an effective public service in South Africa. And it should always start with your values and principles, the common purpose. Why do we have a public service in South Africa? And then the key elements is, number one, a stable, capable and credible leadership. And that should be complemented by having professional and competent staff who then receive proper direction. There is accountability, resulting in successful delivery of public service. Pride and staff morale amongst public servants is all important. And then finally, that will lead to an environment that will attract the best minds to the public service. And then you get this flywheel or this virtuous cycle. And that is typically, I think, what we want to focus on, and also what we and the players in the public service are focusing on in order to ensure that we do have a professional, ethical public service in South Africa. Okay, let's move on to the private sector. Mike, shall I continue, or would you like to, or are there some questions that you want me to take first?
Prof, thank you. I think that's just an incredible opportunity. Unfortunately, our administrator has taken ill and I don't have control for the chat facility. So I wanted to use this opportunity to just alert all the participants to please use the raise the hand facility during the Q&A session. I will recognize you and then I'll give you an opportunity to pose your questions. I apologize for that, but unfortunately it's one of those things. Are there any questions at this stage that any participant would like to pose to Prof Rossouw? I think we'll move on then, Prof, and then I'm sure that there will be many questions during the Q&A session. Back to you, Prof Rossouw.
Good. So let's move on to the private sector perspective. We now have an understanding of where we stand in the public sector. And we know that the situation is considerably better in the private sector, as we've also seen from that Edelman trust barometer, where more than 60% of people in South Africa trust business. Okay, so let's once again look at what is the regulatory framework when it comes to organizational ethics in the private sector. And I think a very important development is the new Companies Act of 2008 that introduced social and ethics committees. It made it a mandatory statutory committee for all state-owned companies, for all companies listed on a stock exchange in South Africa, and also for all companies with significant public interest. And that third category is calculated using your public interest score. It's a certain formula, and if your score is 500 points or higher in any 2 of the last 5 years, your company, whether it's a public company, a private company, a for-profit company, a not-for-profit company, does not matter. If your score is higher than 500 points, you are required by law to have a social and ethics committee. Now, the mandate of a social and ethics committee is twofold. It has both a monitoring function as well as a reporting function. And what needs to be monitored is the company's compliance with relevant regulation and laws, but also in compliance with best practices, global best practices, as far as its impact on the economy, the workplace, the social environment, and the natural environment is concerned. So the Social and Ethics Committee should monitor how a company affects the economy, the people that work for the organization, in other words, the workplace, those people who are affected by our service delivery or the products that we produce, our social environment, and then finally also how do we affect the natural environment in which we operate, and are we in compliance with relevant regulations, but also with global best practice. And that should then be reported. Once you've monitored it and you picked up that there are certain risks most of the time, that should be reported on an ongoing basis to the board of directors, but it should also be reported once a year to shareholders at the annual general meeting of the company. Now, the King IV reports, and by the way, this requirement for social and ethics committees became effective on the 1st of May 2012. So it has been in effect now for more than 9 years already. But when the next King report, King IV, was published in 2016, it commented on this new requirement in the Companies Act, and it said, well, it recommends, because the King report is not legislation, it's a best practice recommendation report. It recommended that not only the companies that we've seen here, in other words, state-owned companies, listed companies, and so-called public interest companies should have social and ethics committees, but they recommended that all organizations who are not required by law to have a social and ethics committee should also make sure that they do govern their social and ethics performance. So it broadened the scope across all companies, but also all organizations in both the public and the private sector. Another thing that King IV did was to remind social and ethics committees that their mandate should include oversight and reporting also on organizational ethics. Because ironically, the word ethics only appeared in the name of the Social and Ethics Committee and never in its mandate. So within its mandate, there was no reference that the committee should also monitor and report on organizational ethics. And King IV tried to correct this, and they were indeed very successful, as you can see in the latest findings in our annual Social and Ethics Committee Trend Survey that we conducted, that reports on organizational ethics is one of the factors or one of the aspects on which social and ethics committees spend most of their time. You can see it is right up there with other important factors such as employee safety and health, broad-based Black economic empowerment, employment equity, and fraud and corruption prevention. So it actually, despite the fact that ethics was neglected, or organizational ethics was neglected in the mandate of the Social and Ethics Committee, the practice in South Africa, driven very much also by the report on corporate governance, lead to a situation where ethics is indeed receiving a lot of attention in the meetings of social and ethics committees. Another thing that King 4 also did was to move beyond King 3, that said in principle 1 effectively, to King 4 that goes beyond ethics management and says, and this is the principle that I showed you before, that the governing body should govern the ethics in a way that supports the establishment of an ethical culture. So a big shift to ethical culture. I want to show you, just in closing, some of the findings that we did in our South African Business Ethics Survey. It's a survey that we conduct every 3 years. So we've just completed the 2021 survey. And on Thursday this week, we will some of the findings of that survey. So we conducted, the sample was 19 large and listed companies with about 2,200.
I'm sorry to interject, Prof, but you are breaking up. I'm not sure if everybody's experiencing it, but you may want to consider just switching your camera off in the interests of maintaining bandwidth and the sound. So just switch your camera off and let the sound go. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I already switched off my camera. Can you just confirm that?
No, you can't do that because we see the presentation. No, it's fine. I think carry on, Prof. We're just going to have to go through, because if you switch your camera off, we're not going to see the presentation. So please continue, Prof.
Okay. So at the moment, could you just confirm? Can you see the presentation or not?
Yes, we can, Prof.
Okay. Good. So let me show you some of the findings. Over that sample of almost 20 large and listed companies, we found that on average, on a scale of 0 to 100, where 0 would be a very weak ethical culture and 100 would be a very mature ethical culture, that the average for those companies sat at 63. So indicating that there is a lot happening, but there's also moderate risk that there can be improvement. And we look specifically at these 7 sub-dimensions because from literature and also from other research on organizational ethics, we know that these are the building blocks of an ethical culture. Ethical treatment, in other words, do you treat people in a fair and respectful manner? Ethics accountability, are there consequences for unethical behavior, but also consequences for ethical behavior? In other words, do you hold people accountable when they do the right things, but also when they do the wrong things? And then we looked at employee commitment to ethics. Is there a commitment on employee level? Is there a commitment on middle management level? Are people aware of your ethical standards? Are there regular conversations about ethics, or what we call ethics talk? And are there top leadership commitment to ethics? And here you can see the scores that we find. And this is now on average, that the lowest scores representing the highest risk were in the ethical treatment of staff and also in ethics accountability. In other words, people not being held accountable for what they do. While the ones with the lowest risk is number one, first of all, that there is strong top leadership commitment to ethics. 73% of our sample agree to that, and also that there is regular talk about ethics in organizations. And just to show you some trends here, over the last 4 surveys that we conducted, have you encountered unethical behavior? And here are the percentages of people who said, yes, I have encountered unethical behavior. And while there was a low point of 14% in 2013, which is excellent, that has unfortunately now climbed to almost a third of employees who said, I have encountered unethical behavior. And then we also asked them, so did you report the unethical behavior that you observed? And there we see that there was a drop around 2016, where only about half of people who saw unethical, who observed unethical behavior, reported that. Fortunately, we see an incline, and in the most recent survey, we've seen even more improvement there. So in other words, a high tendency amongst people to report unethical conduct. Start with this, when we ask people, so tell us why did you not report the unethical behavior that you observed? The two top factors was, I was afraid that I might be victimized. In other words, retaliation by the organization was the one big factor. And the other big factor was, I did not believe that anything would be done. And I think this is something that we can always keep in mind, that people only report, number one, if they feel that it is safe to report, and number two, if they think it's worthwhile reporting because my report will be taken seriously. And that, not only here in South Africa, but we also find it right across the world, are normally the two factors that has the biggest impact on whether people report unethical conduct or not. Okay, Mike, I think I'm going to stop sharing there, and we can go into and take some questions if there are.
Thank you so much for that, Prof. Great. Would anyone like to open the batting? Do we have any questions? Just raise your hand or just unmute your mic. Hlengiwe, please, I recognize you. Please continue.
Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Dr. Rossouw, for a very incisive presentation. Just a comment, not a question. I think when it comes to ethics, ethical behavior, probably the biggest challenge that we are contending with, it's not that there are no ethical standards, there are no whistleblowing, we don't have a framework, whether in King 3, in King 4. I think we face a unique challenge, and I'm not so sure how do we address this. We are trying to instill and inculcate an ethical culture, whether in public or private sector. But we actually live in a postmodern society where even the issue of morality is under contestation. If we say to people, why do you do this? It's not moral. They will ask you whose morality is important. When you say to people, this is not true, even the definition of what is true, it's being challenged. And I just feel that I think King has done well, everyone is doing well, but there are these fundamental issues that we find ourselves in, and we need to be able to deal with the challenges that afflict a postmodern society. And these things are not things that we talk about readily, but it's things that we think about, and they inform our worldview in terms of how we treat clients or how we hold ourselves out in a work environment. Thank you. That's my comment.
Okay, Mike, would you like me to respond?
Please, right away? Please, Prof. We have the best part of 14 minutes, so I'm very happy for you just to respond to Hlengiwe's observations.
Yeah, and it's a great point that you make, that truth is contested. We live in a so-called post-truth society, and we've seen a lot of that. And in that, if you go and look at that Edelman trust survey, that Edelman trust barometer, the institution who lost most trust is the provider.
Prof, we're losing you. We're losing you, unfortunately.
Information. And please confirm, can you hear me now?
That's better. Thanks, Prof.
Okay, yeah. So you're absolutely right by saying that when you start talking about ethics, people might ask, okay, so whose ethics are you talking about? But this is exactly why you need ethics to be managed in your organization, because we can't allow people to live by whatever standards they select. We need to find in organizations a consensus about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And this is a big part of managing ethics, to get people together and to say, okay, around gifts, what type of gifts or what type of entertainment is acceptable, and what type of entertainment or gifts, either to give or receive, is not acceptable. And this is how you build that consensus in your organization. Obviously, people in power can impose standards on other people, but that is never a good solution, because people would only do the right thing as long as they are being watched. And the moment that nobody watches them, they would simply revert back to their old ways. And that is why a lot of the work that we do in organizations is about building a consensus in our organization. What are the standards of acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior? And there can be quite rigorous and heated discourses about that in your company, but ultimately you need to come to a view on what will we accept and what do we find unacceptable, and then there's an expectation by everyone or for everyone to abide by that. Okay, Mike, thanks. Can we move on?
Thanks so much. Dr. Rossouw, I saw your hand up and now it's disappeared. Are you still there?
Hi, Mike. I am indeed. Yeah, just a quick question, and maybe with a long answer. It's kind of like where to next. I think, in line with what Klingli was saying about kind of the postmodernism, but I think there's some practical issues around consequence management, and I'm just interested in your insights around where do we take that next? Because clearly we are building parameters, we're building standards, but if I look at the scandals in both the public and the private sector, I'm not seeing people going to jail. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how do we take consequence management forward as a potential link to making ethics work. Thank you.
Yeah, it is indeed, Dr. Rossouw, a very important point, because if there are no consequences, then it can be perceived as that the organization is condoning it, or that society is condoning that. And I think what we see in South Africa is a very, very strong and very determined effort to ensure that institutions who are there to hold other people accountable, that those institutions are being strengthened again. Because part of state capture was to focus specifically on our accountability institutions. Those institutions that should hold other people accountable was deliberately undermined. And for the reason that they can't play the role that they are supposed to play. And I think what we've seen is a strengthening of all those institutions, starting with the National Prosecuting Authority, the Special Investigations Unit, and also other accountability institutions in the country. And I think we can see the first fruits already. We had a recent webinar where we had the National Director of Public Prosecutions, and she gave us quite a long list, because people often say nothing is happening, nobody's going to jail. If you engage with her, she can give you quite a list of people already in jail for corrupt practices. And I think we are all well aware of court cases as we speak that are playing out. And in that webinar, she made a very telling point. She said, remember, the process does not start when you sit in jail. the incarceration of the mind starts much earlier. And those people who are now accused and are now in front of our courts, they are finding themselves already in a very uncomfortable, psychologically very uncomfortable situation, and the suffering or the penalties has already started kicking in. But give it time to play out. But there's just one other point that I would like to make, Dr. Rossouw, and that is often when we think about consequence management, we think of the negative version thereof. In other words, when you do something wrong, some form of punishment should be meted out. However, if we want to build ethical cultures, there should also be consequences for doing the right thing. In other words, there should be recognition when people do the right thing, and there should be some form of praise or some form of reward, because that is how you build an ethical culture. Not by only focusing on what you do want, but by emphasizing what you do want and reinforcing that whenever you see that. Okay, Mike.
Thank you very much. Ralph, I see you. Over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the presentation. We've recently been acquired. We were an employee-owned company, and now been acquired by a public listed company. And, you know, I think really important, but most of the principles, if not all the principles we adhered to and endorsed, and the transition's been pretty easy. The one area that has really stepped up our game is looking at our clients and doing a strong, detailed assessment of our clients and making sure that there are clients we want to work for, and that's led to some sort of cultural changes, which is really positive as well. My question really is, and I think it's maybe just an evolution of the progression of our understanding, is that I saw you on your slides that the middle management need to be committed. And I thought that was really interesting, because in the past, you know, we will all say the owners or the top management, the ones that really sign this off. But maybe just give us some of your thoughts about the middle management, and maybe even devolving that further into the organization.
Yeah, Ralph, I'm very glad that you raised this, because this is such a crucial issue. And we find that if you have top leadership commitment, but you don't have middle management leadership commitment to ethics, it does not cascade down to your employees. And the maturity of your ethical culture suffer as a result of that. And this is incredibly important if you want to build that ethical culture, that you make sure that not only the people sitting in the C-suite are committed to ethics, but that those middle managers who interact on a daily basis with the other employees in the company, that they show an equally strong commitment. Mervyn King, who was chairing till recently the King Committee on Corporate Governance, always said you need to have both the tone at the top, but also the mood in the middle. And if you don't have both, it simply doesn't translate to also building that awareness and that commitment to ethics on the lower levels. So absolutely right. It is often neglected, but it is crucial. And if you don't get it right, you won't get that strong commitment to ethics across your entire organization.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that incisive response, Prof. Adolfina, I saw your hand up. I recognize you. I see you. The floor is yours.
No, Mike, the discussion has already been had. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you so much. We have literally 3 minutes. We might run over by 2 minutes. Prof, are you comfortable that we go over by about 2 or 3 minutes?
Yes, totally.
Thank you so much. Are there any further questions? Please raise your hand and I will recognize you immediately. Well, you certainly covered the ground. Oh, we have one. Lengiwi, over to you. I see you, Hengiwi.
Yes, no, thanks, Mike. I just wanted to follow a follow-up comment to what Dr. Rossouw raised. And I know Professor Rossouw said, in terms of incarceration, the NPA is making inroads. And I think the reason why maybe some of us have low confidence in that is just when we review the case of the erstwhile President Jacob Zuma, and what it means his incarceration for consequent management. I mean, the first time the NPA actually had a case against him, I remember this very well. My son was in grade 1. And the case is still ongoing. He's doing a second year at university. And he was also incarcerated for not observing the Constitutional Court directive. He was in jail for 58 days. That includes for 58 days. And I think that does undermine issues of consequence management and whether is our justice system working. It's something that we cannot just take for granted. So I think Dr. Reisma's point is still very relevant. I mean, is the NPA serious? Are we going to see any meaningful consequent management? Are we going to see people going to jail? Because the first classic case that they were supposed to nail and make sure that the person is in jail took more than 18 years, and the person was incarcerated for 58 days. What does this mean then? Thank you.
Okay.
I'm glad you're going to answer that question, Ross.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm of course not here to defend anyone, neither the NPA nor anyone else. So I can really speak objectively here, I think. But I would just say, let's take two things into account. Number one, that the NPA was the very target of state capture. In other words, during that time that we now refer to, for a certain period of time, that institution was also captured. And then there was a new appointment, and I think the appointment was done in a very objective manner. For the first time, it's not the president who just appointed anyone. He made it a public process so that there can be objectivity in the selection. And I personally believe that a good choice has been made there. Just on the fact that he has only been in jail, that Jacob Zuma has only been in jail for a short period of time, I think also worthwhile remembering that the NPA did their job. In other words, they prosecuted. The reason why he is no longer in jail is because some of the people loyal to him found a gap. And it was the director of correctional services, and you would know that that is also now contested in court, who made sure that he got out of jail way too early. So I think let's give credit where credit is due, and let's blame the blameworthy. And yeah, just those two perspectives, I think, on the matter that was raised.
Prof, thank you so much for that comprehensive response. We just about 1 minute past 12. Wow, I'm sure if everybody had their way, we would keep you here for at least another 2 hours. Thank you for addressing the elephant in the room. And whilst I'm on that subject, thank you for catching the tiger by its tail. Your robust approach to addressing these issues. Around the dinner table, we continue to debate these things. There are many that will say we've lost our moral compass. Let's hope your address this morning has helped us have hope, and in the future, where we will once again be regarded as an ethical nation, prepared to do the right thing in the interest of everybody. It is now my pleasure to call on Mr. Craig Sumption, the CFO of Hatch Africa, to provide some concluding remarks and a vote of thanks. Craig, over to you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you to you and your team for arranging these sessions. They're really of great interest. And thank you, Professor Rossouw, for a very interesting discussion. Definitely stirs up the topic and the thoughts. I think interesting your slide on the culture of ethics and the aspect of independent assessment is very key, because I think that is still lacking in a big way. And everyone has their own view as to where the ethical line sits. Your 2018 survey of the public sector as well, interesting with the number of internal aspects that are raised in that one and how many of those come up. And then the private sector side, there's no doubt. Most people think it's largely the public sector, but the private sector has a number of challenges as well. And the survey showing that there's an increase in encountering unethical behavior, and that is definitely a concern. That increase comes despite the fact that, as you have got it there as well, the reporting is a lot less. Really, really interesting topic, challenging situation. There's no doubt that we've still got a long road to travel, but thank you for the work that you do and the information that you're prepared to share on that to help us in that process. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Craig, thank you so much for that. To you, our members and our partners, it is your participation in events such as these that makes it so worthwhile for us to continue doing it. Prof, certainly from our side, thank you so much for agreeing so readily to participate, and I look forward to seeing you on Thursday the 18th. I know it's in your diary.
Thank you.
To everybody, have a wonderful week. Let's stay positive and let's call out whatever we see or believe to be incorrect. Have a wonderful day all, and goodbye.